Hello and welcome. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here for this program, but just as important, all of you who are brave enough to show up to talk about the bizarre history of Minnesota in the safety of wherever you're watching this program. So, with that, let's begin. My name is Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background's actually in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, UFOs, reports of alien abductions, really weird people, odd places, you name it. If it's just strange and a little offbeat, I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities. But what I found on my discoveries is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Some of the most bizarre history Minnesota has to offer. For the next 45 minutes, we'll cover some of the strangest stories you may never heard about Minnesota. And of course, if you listen to the rest of the country, they believe people in Minnesota are weird for their own right. Because if you believe the national perspective about Minnesota is that everybody lives in the Twin Cities. Everyone's a crazy Vikings fan. Fargo is actually in Minnesota. Everyone has a cabin and everyone is super nice. And even though this last one may be true, I'm going to be talking about a different Minnesota. A darker, stranger, and more sinister Minnesota. We're going to be talking about some of the weirdest stories the state has to offer. So what are we going to talk about? Well, everything from bizarre deaths and ghosts all the way down to psychic phenomena and UFOs. I've also thrown in what I call keep in minds. And since this program's focusing mainly on the early days, the late 1800s, early 1900s, stories that were thought to be lost to history, I've thrown in a lot of keep in minds. Things that aren't necessarily really odd, but stuff about Minnesota you may not have known. For instance, in the time period I'm operating in, 1870, the population of Minnesota was just over 430,000 people. Today, over 5.5 million people call the state home. So back then they had a lot more room to spread out and be weird, and believe me, they took full advantage of that space. First stop, that of bizarre deaths. Now, if you open up your newspaper today and flip to the obituary section, you'll probably read stories similar to this. Old Man Lewis died peacefully, surrounded by his loving family. But again, the era in which I was operating, I was finding different types of obituaries. I was finding things like this. Suicide is gruesome. Whole top of his head blown off by the blast. Quite a bit different than being surrounded by your loving family and going peacefully. And it illustrates that newspapers of this era, they didn't really care so much about the cause of death, what happened. They were simply more interested in selling newspapers, which is why you got a lot of headlines of weird deaths like this one. Man kills himself because he's homely. Out of Albert Lee, he was courting a young girl. He went to the theater and saw her there with another suitor. He was so distraught about this that for theatrical effect, he grabbed a pistol, put it to his heart, and pulled the trigger because she did not want him. But don't feel too bad when you hear about these people dying at a young age. The period I'm talking about, the average life expectancy in the United States was only 47 years of age. So when these people died at a young age, they weren't missing out on a lot of life expectancy. Today, we love being scared in controlled environments, whether it's going to the movie theater or to an amusement park. People love getting frightened. But in the old days, being frightened could kill you. Such is the case here of a postmaster that died from fright while being inspected of his accounts. He was $150 short in his accounts, and rather face up to the possibility of embezzlement, he simply joined the Grim Reaper instead. Other times you had cases where they had to figure out how the death actually happened. Like in this case in Stillwater, where a woman was found dead in her house with her cat, and it was thought that it was a suicide. But upon further investigation, they found that the woman's cat was very sick. So she went to put it out of its misery, opened up a jar of chloroform. But before she was able to grab the cat, the fumes overran the house, and she succumbed to those fumes and died along with the cat, calling it a freak accident. But if you were dead, you had nothing to worry about. Others worried actually of being buried alive and the fear of being buried while they were still breathing. But is this anything more than an urban legend or folklore? Was anyone ever buried alive? Well, yes, we know thousands of people were buried alive. We know this because we have thousands of newspaper accounts from the late 1800s, early 1900s. Back then, whether you were in a diabetic shock or in a coma, doctors would often pronounce you dead. But lo and behold, many people, some of which were even at their own funeral, would pop up in the nick of time to be saved from being buried alive. This may seem a silly fear to us today with modern science and medicine, but our grandparents were so frightened of being buried alive, they came up with several inventions to stop this. One of which was a spring-loaded coffin. It had a lever on the inside that if you pulled it, it would spring the top of your coffin up. I don't know how well it worked with 6 feet of dirt on top of it, but I do have several stories of pallbearers not being as careful as they should, and it popped up the top, giving everyone quite a scare. But my favorite invention was this. It's called a cemetery bell, and it does or did exactly what it looks like it would do. It was a bell you could have above your grave with a rope on a pole going down into your casket. So if you awoke in time and found yourself buried alive, all you'd have to do is tug that rope, it would ring the bell and alert the caretaker who lived there that you had been buried alive and they could come and rescue you. But there was one problem with this invention though. On many nights, the wind would set these bells off, giving the caretaker quite a scare, thinking everyone had been buried alive. It was actually your duty to sit around your parents' or family or relatives' graves, making sure that they were truly dead, that they wouldn't rise up. But I'm going to move on from strange deaths. Not because I don't find it fascinating, I do, but because it's dangerous. I found dozens of cases of people merely talking about death when death paid them a visit. They'd be discussing something about death and they would drop dead. So I'm going to move on to our next category while I still can. And that is ghost and haunted areas. You can't throw a rock in Minnesota without hitting a place that has a haunted reputation. And if you're looking to go to one haunted place in Minnesota, I recommend you head down south to Jackson, Minnesota, to Loon Lake Cemetery. Actually, I recommend you don't go to this cemetery because the locals, they call it Witch Cemetery. The legend is, many years ago, a young girl by the name of Mary Jane was practicing witchcraft, the dark arts. And the community, in order to stop her from bringing evil spirits to the village, took an axe, chopped up her head, and dumped her body and the axe in a grave out at Loon Lake Cemetery. And now, it is said that if you walk out on this quarter-mile makeshift path to the cemetery, the spirit of that witch will still be out there. And when you get out there, the first thing you'll realize is that a lot of the graves are abandoned, neglected, and heavily vandalized throughout the area. People have all kinds of experiences out here. Weird balls of light, disembodied voices. But my favorite story is the dare. And the dare is that if you come out here and jump or walk over the grave of the witch, you'll be cursed with bad luck until the day you die. Every year I hear from a handful of people who claim that mishap, misfortune, and even death happened after they or their friends took the dare. When I first went here about 20 years ago, I was really excited to try the dare for myself. But the problem is we don't know which grave is the witch's. In fact, nearly half the graves are unmarked and the rest are in disarray. Not even the plat books know who is buried where. In fact, Mary Jane, that alleged witch, her gravestone sits down at the Historical Society's museum. They have it there for safekeeping because they were afraid somebody was going to steal it. Others claim that there are as many as 3 separate witches inside the graveyard. But since we don't know which grave is the witch's, my recommendation is jump over every grave you can find, thereby increasing the chances of the witch cursing you while you're there. Of course, not everyone believes there are witches at this cemetery, which is the reason when you go there, the first thing you'll see is this sign saying no ghosts or witches exist in Loon Lake Cemetery. But you don't have to take their word for it. You don't have to take my word for it. You can take your own word for it. Because right out in front of the path to the cemetery is this small self-registering campground where you can spend the night and decide for yourself. It is so secluded, no one will bother you while you're camping. At least not anyone who's alive, that is. Keep in mind, Minnesota is the home of spam. If you go to Austin, they have a wonderful new spam museum showing the wonderful history of whatever the heck spam happens to be. Believe it or not, this is the most commonly asked question I receive. Where can I go to spend the night in a haunted place? And if you have that macabre sense of adventure, you're in luck. Because in Minnesota you have haunted campgrounds, B&Bs, hotels, and motels. One of my favorites is the old Palmer House Hotel in Sauk Center, world famous for being the boyhood home of novelist Sinclair Lewis. One of the main stories of it being haunted tells of a young boy who was getting medical treatment nearby. He was staying at the home, and unfortunately he passed away. And now many guests report seeing him on the staircase leading up to the 2nd floor. Oftentimes people checking out state that they had a wonderful stay, but somebody let their kid bounce a ball through the hallway at all times of the night. But when they went out to investigate, no one could be found. It's also in the bar strange things happen. Bottles go flying off the wall and set down as though thrown by some unseen force. Bartenders have their name called or they're tapped on the shoulder. When they spin around, nobody can be found. Another story tells of someone coming up, ordering a drink, and then vanishing right into thin air. But what I love about the Palmer House is a lot of places will have one room that's haunted or one area that has a lot of activity. Where the Palmer House, it seems to happen all over the place. One of my favorite stories came from some honeymooners, newlyweds, spending their honeymoon at the Palmer House. In the middle of the summer with the air off, the woman awoke in the middle of the night when the room was freezing cold. Her husband was sleeping and she looked down at the foot of the bed just in time to see the ghostly image of a man disappear from the bed. She immediately woke up her husband, but by the time he came to, the man was simply vanished. If you do stay here, make sure you get into the basement. It's a really creepy place down there. A lot of activity seems to happen down in the basement. Objects move on their own. Shadowy figures have been spotted throughout the basement as well. You can spend the night in complete darkness down there, trying to have your own experience. This next category, medical anomalies, are things maybe today's science could explain, but back then they had no idea what was going on. Now, just as a little question, how many of you like a glass of coffee or a cup of coffee a day? Quite a few of you. Well, be careful, because for one lady, coffee made her insane. Now granted, she drank 20 quarts of coffee a day, which is probably a little more than the average consumer. But she actually was committed into an insane asylum. And they took her off coffee thinking that would help her medical ailments or help her regain her sanity. But in fact, it had the opposite effect. Without coffee, she went even more berserk and crazy, ended up spending the rest of her life in the insane asylum. Keep in mind, Tonka trucks were invented, developed in Minnesota as well. This next case, which talks about the Woolly Girl, is a great illustration of how other states try to take appreciation or take control of a story that is not involving them. Because this Illinois newspaper claimed that the Woolly Girl was from Illinois. And she was called the Woolly Girl because she had fine hair growing all over her face. You can see silky hair covering 9 inches long. But she wasn't from Illinois. She was from Minnesota. Her name was Alice Elizabeth Doherty. She went on to become a well-known performer or freak of nature of the time. And she wasn't part sheep or a woolly girl. She simply suffered from a genetic disorder called hypertrichosis. And those afflicted with this genetic disorder will usually grow hair all over their face and upper portion of their torso. Oftentimes, people born with this disease would be brought to the carnival and be put on display as freaks of nature. If they were lucky, they would go on tour with P.T. Barnum of Barnum Brothers, Barnum and Ringling Brothers Family Circus, or Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not fame. And I say if they were lucky, they would go on tour with these men and be displayed as freaks of nature, because their parents would allow them to go off in the company of these men, knowing that they would make a lot of money and have a much better life than they would back on the farm in Minnesota. In fact, at one point, P.T. Barnum and one of his freaks of nature, General Tom Thumb, were two of the wealthiest men in America. P.T. Barnum was so wealthy that he lost everything he had and then regained it to become wealthy twice in his lifetime. I love this category, mysterious creatures. Creatures that science says do not exist. Skeptics say they can't exist, yet every year people in Minnesota were coming face to face with them. Perhaps the most deadly and terrifying one was that of the Wendigo, the monster of the north. This murderous being that originated with the First Nation people of Canada. It was known by many names and various spellings. In northern Minnesota, this creature was thought to be a harbinger of death, meaning that if you heard it or saw it, much like seeing or hearing the Irish Banshee, it meant you or someone you knew was going to die very shortly. If you head way up by the Canadian border to the small town of Ross near Roseau and War Road, you'll see that there's not much there today. But back in the 1800s, this place was called Indian Village, as it's shown here, because several hundred native peoples lived there, along with several white pioneer families, one of which was Jacob Nelson. and Jake Nelson kept a detailed journal about his life in the Roseau Valley. Most of his pretty mundane fishing trips, hunting expeditions, the weather. But Nelson did talk about two paranormal events up in the Roseau Valley. One of which is what he called the Will o' the Wisp, this mysterious ball of light that would dance around the village, disappear, and then reappear somewhere else in a matter of seconds. Nobody wanted to try to capture it because they thought it was too much like playing tag with the devil. Nelson also heard about a creature that the natives believed in, the Wendigo, and he thought it was nothing more than superstition. That is, until he saw it himself. And sure enough, the very next day, an elder in the community passed away. Jake Nelson went on to report several more accounts of this Wendigo. Each time it was seen, it was somewhere between 8 and 15 feet tall. White-skinned, white-furred, or white-clothed, it always appeared to be white. Sometimes it had a ball of light that would accompany it, maybe that will-o'-the-wisp. And every time it was spotted up in Ross, someone passed away very shortly after its appearance. People up in that area still believe that the Wendigo is making its way around. In fact, many do not like building snowmen in winter because it's thought that a Wendigo could inhabit the snowman and come to life and curse or kill or consume your entire town, village, or tribe. Keep in mind, during Prohibition, every big-name gangster of the day made their way to Minnesota. From John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Alvin Creepy Karpus, Ma Barker and the gang, Al Capone, George Bugs Moran, you name it, if they were a well-known gangster, they came to Minnesota. But Minnesota had a lot of other weird creatures outside of the Wendigo. One of my favorite was a creature the media was calling the devil moose. It was in the early 1900s when this giant moose was said to be up in the northwoods of Minnesota. It seemed to be some type of Dr. Frankenstein's creation, of huge beyond any proportion. Some say it had bear claws on the front. People swore that it was actually real. So much so that a posse of hunters gathered on several occasions to try to capture this devil moose, but they simply could not find it. I'll leave it up to you to determine whether or not the devil moose was making its way up in the Northwoods to this very day. I put this category of oddities together because these cases didn't seem to fit into any other category, so I made their own category for them. Keep in mind, Minnesota has more miles of bike trails than any other state in the Union. Now I know a lot of you watching here on this program are married. And without a doubt, you're happily married. But if you're not happily married, you may want to do what this next gentleman did. Because he wasn't happily married, so he decided to marry the mother of his wife. Yes, in fact, he divorced his wife and married her mother. He said it was the best decision he had ever made. And by all counts, it worked out wonderfully, at least for the husband and his former mother-in-law. Some of you probably make your way up to the North Shore, Duluth area on vacation or getting away for a weekend. But if you do go to Duluth, watch out for all the rats in Duluth. I have many stories of these newspaper accounts of how Duluth was overrun by giant rats that were making their way all over Duluth. Well, I'm happy to report that I've been to Duluth many times. I've never seen the city overrun by rats, but maybe they're just regrouping and making their return to terrorize tourists some 140 years later. Keep in mind, in the time period I'm talking about during this program, the average height of an American male was only 5 feet 6 inches. In fact, the largest person ever on record was that of Robert Wadlow of Alton, Illinois. He died while still growing. he was a wee bit short of being 9 feet tall when he died. They have a life-size statue of him in Alton, Illinois. You can see how gigantic he truly was. They also have one at Ripley's Believe It or Not Auditorium in Wisconsin Dells as well. Keep in mind, Minnesota claims to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. But before you get too excited, so do the states of Wisconsin, Vermont, Maine, Michigan, even Canada, all claims to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. But regardless of where Paul was born, Minnesota has more roadside attractions devoted to Paul and Babe than any other state in the entire country. This next case may illustrate how far we've come today as a society, or maybe how far we have not come as a society. And it talks about the first arrival of a Sioux scalp that was being brought to a store in the St. Paul area, and it was going to be put on display, and it was from one of the battles in the local area. What's terrifying about this news article is that the paper went on to report that several other skulls are coming and scalps are coming to the store, and they will be put on display for anybody who wishes to go down to the store and see them. Again, maybe this illustrates how far we've come, or how far we still have to come as a country. Here's a question. How many of you out there have watched this Oscar-winning movie? Several of you? Well, if you haven't, the premise is pretty simple. A serial killer who happens to dabble in voodoo is shot by the police. But before he dies, he casts a spell that puts his soul into the doll of a named Chucky. And he comes to life trying to kill or murder or curse anybody who gets in his way. But we know these stories only happen in Hollywood, right? Well, Hollywood, or Janesville, Minnesota. Here you have the infamous Janesville dollhouse. For decades, people talked about this creepy doll that sat up in the window of the house. Some say it was put there because a man committed suicide, or one of his family members committed suicide, or a family killed one of their children, and many other versions. And now the doll was alive. We don't know why the doll was there. The owner who had it there for decades did not tell anyone why he put it there. And then when he passed on, it was said that he had the reason put into a time capsule for the city that will be opened at a much later date. But even though we don't know why the creepy doll was there, people believed it was cursed. In fact, people would go out of their way, young folks, to avoid this house because every time they walked by, they claimed the doll would come to life and watch them as they moved across the sidewalk or the street. Over the years, it became a tourist destination where people would walk across trying to take the dare. And the dare was that if you rode your bike or walked or drove past the house, the doll would move and come to life, and you'd be cursed with bad luck until the day you died. But then the owner died, as I mentioned, and the doll went missing. People were terrified in Janesville. They thought they'd wake up and find it in bed with them at night. But don't worry, they found a new place for the doll. And it was a great place for the doll, because what better place would you want to put a doll that could take your life? Where else could you put a doll that could curse you with bad luck? Well, the only reason or place that you'd put it would be at your town's local library. In fact, they put it right up in the front window where people could see it, go inside, and take a look at it. And yes, I'm talking in the past tense, because the library said too many people were afraid to come into the library because of the creepy doll, so they had to remove it from the library. So the doll now sits in a private person's collection in the area. They're trying to put it on display somewhere in Janesville, but it seems to be too creepy for anyone to want it in the town. Don't worry, you're not going to see any of your neighbors in this section. It's too far long ago for them to be here. But Minnesota has a long history of unique people coming from the state. Keep in mind, water skiing was invented in Lake City, Minnesota on Lake Pepin by Ralph Samuelson in 1922. One of the yarns people tells is that Samuelson invented water skiing to avoid Pepe, the lake monster of Lake Pepin, to get away from Pepe in the boat. Today we're all familiar with the Me Too movement, but you good people of Minnesota were way ahead on this movement, as evidenced by this case back in 1868 that talked about a friend harassing his buddy's wife. So much so, kept trying to assault and kiss her all the time that they finally had to take him to court, and he was found guilty, arrested, and fined $25 in costs. Quite a sum of money in 1868. Showing that once again you were ahead on the Me Too movement. But I think this man could have saved himself a lot of money and a lot of heartache if he just simply would have married her mother instead of her, like the previous man in our lecture today. Keep in mind you have nearly 12,000 lakes in Minnesota, even though you're known as the land of 10,000 lakes. This next gentleman was an odd character. He was bored one day and started rolling a little bit of twine in his hand. Eventually he rolled a little bit more and a little bit more. Over a few years, he rolled a lot more. But you can see by 1979, his ball of twine was 9 tons and 12 feet wide. It was shown as the largest ball of twine in America. Well, I should specify, it's the largest ball of twine that was done by one person. It sits in Darwin, Minnesota now. What's interesting is there are several other balls bigger of twine in the United States, but those have been community projects and efforts. This is still the biggest one done by one person. Remember the story of being buried alive from earlier? This next gentleman must have read that story because he was terrified of his family being buried alive. His name was Olaf Swenson from Montevideo, Minnesota. And he lived in this home here, which is now open for tours from the Minnesota Historical Society. By all counts, he was a weird and odd character. Very religious. He turned the top of his house into a makeshift chapel where he would give sermons to rocks on the pews. And at night, neighbors could hear mysterious chantings and talk and singing coming from the pretty much empty top portion of his home. He also wanted to get rid of his political rival and put him out of business. So old man Swenson put a mill on his farm. He wanted to get rid of his rival. Unfortunately for Swenson, his rival was a man called Mr. Pillsbury. Didn't go very well for Swenson. But that's not the scary part. The scary part came from the fact that his daughters were all diabetic. And they died at a young age. And instead of burying them in the local cemetery, he buried them in his front yard because he thought they may have been buried alive. Legend tells that he had tunnels built down to the graves where he would listen at night or pour water down to make sure that they were okay. Others claim that in the basement he had tunnels going to the grave where he would listen after his sermons at night to hear for the calls of his daughters that were thought to have been buried alive. The home is thought to be haunted, of course, and you can go there and take a tour and see if you can find any of those tunnels that he used to keep an ear out for his daughters being buried alive. Psychic phenomena. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, psychic phenomena was all the rage. You'd have all kinds of stories of psychics, intuitives that would come and perform at the local theater. Hundreds of people would show up to these people, whether they were doing seances or readings, communicating with the dead and the deceased. It was a very bright honor to be invited to one of these things, because it was very interesting for people of that time with the whole spiritualist movement, which believed that when you died, not only did you continue on, but people could communicate with you from the afterlife as well. This next case is pretty odd. It takes place in Winona, Minnesota, and it talks about a vampire or death siren in Winona. 1922, and it talks about Mrs. Block, Frances Block. She was buried at St. Mary's Cemetery. And when she died, all of a sudden, many of her brothers started following her in death. And eventually, it got to be so much of her family that was dying that neighbors in the east end of Winona, this is where the Block family lived, started telling her father that she was the cause of the family's deaths. It was believed by many superstitious people at that time that the first person in a family that died would then act like a death siren and try to entice their siblings to join them in death. So it was believed that Frances was summoning her relatives and her siblings to death. So the only course of operation the father had was to go out to the graveyard and dig up her body and cut off her head and bury it separately from the body. That would stop the death. And he did. He went out to the graveyard, dug up his daughter. But apparently he chickened out at cutting off the head and instead put a cross on the mouth of his daughter and reburied her. When the police found out about this story, they actually went out and dug up the body of Mrs. Block to see if she had been desecrated. And in fact, she hadn't. So the interesting part is they did not charge the father for the crime. Apparently in the 1920s, as long as you didn't harm a body, you could dig it up in Winona. As you can see, I've been to that cemetery many times looking for that vampire woman. Luckily for me, she has never attacked me, but then again, I bring my vampire hunting kit with me when I go to the cemetery. Keep in mind, the coal-fired furnace regulator was invented, the thermostat, in Minnesota as well. And sometimes psychic phenomena extends to animals as well. This was an animal that was purchased. Its name was Hoodoo. And back then, Hoodoo was meant as a curse. Someone that was cursed with bad luck would be hoodooed. And the horse's name was Hoodoo because it had killed its previous owner. But its new owner bought it thinking it was nothing more than superstition. That is, till the horse kicked over some lamps and started a barn fire, which killed all the farmers' 29 animals in the blaze. Lived up to its name of being hoodooed. The last category we're going to talk about at this program is that of UFOs, unidentified flying objects. Of course, skeptics claim the only reason people see UFOs, the only reason people believe in UFOs, is because of Hollywood and the media. TV shows like The X-Files and Unsolved Mysteries, movies like Men in Black and Independence Day. That's why we believe in UFOs. Hollywood has shown us and treated us to believing in UFOs. But what you'll see here in this program is that people in Minnesota were seeing weird things in the sky long before Mulder and Scully were out there investigating. First off, I'm going to show you older cases to show how the newspapers covered these UFO sightings. Because you'd have stories out of cities in Minnesota of weird objects. And the most common newspaper was, what are they drinking in St. Paul? Or what are they drinking in Lanesboro where they're seeing UFOs? Here's one talking about an airship passing over it with many people witnessing it, seem to be traveling quite fast. Now I threw this illustration on the bottom not because it shows Duluth or even a UFO, but it illustrates that people of this era spent a lot more time outside than we do today. In fact, nearly 50% of the country was involved in farming outdoors Today, that's less than 2% of the country. And oftentimes, they'd sit outside in the summer waiting for their house to cool down. If it didn't cool down, they simply slept outside on the yard. So it shows that people were outside more, so it's only fitting they would see more things in the sky. Just as a mental experiment for the next week or so, keep track of how long you spend staring at the night sky. If you're like a lot of people, especially in winter, it's probably not that long. This was a very important year in ufology, 1897. Hundreds of cities across the Midwest. There were thousands of people who spotted airships moving across their city. You could actually follow them in Minnesota from one city to the next as newspapers were covering the stories as they went from one city to the next. But UFOs continued on all throughout the state. In the 1950s, 1960s, there was a rash of UFO sightings in Minnesota. Keep in mind the Kensington runestone was discovered in 1898. And if many people believe this is evidence that explorers were here long before we thought they were. Others believe that it's a hoax and nothing more than an elaborate hoax. I'll let you go to the Kensington Runestone Museum and decide for yourself. Very easy to find. It's right across the street from the gigantic Viking statue in downtown. Perhaps one of the weirdest stories of UFOs happened in Long Prairie, 1965. A young radio DJ was going into work one day when all of a sudden he passed a bend in the road here when he saw what appeared to be a 40-foot spaceship rocket-looking thing in the middle of the road. After seeing this, he thought to himself, none of my friends are going to believe me. I better run this thing over so they'll believe me. And when he got close to it, his car lost power. The engine died, everything shut off. Thinking as only a 19-year-old could think, he just thought, I'll get out and go push it over. Not a big deal. And when he got to the front of his car, he paused because an opening appeared on the craft and out got a bunch of little 6-inch oil can looking creatures. The young man said he couldn't see any eyes or cameras on them, but he got the distinct feeling that they knew he was there and they were watching him. They seemed to be doing some maintenance on the underbelly of the craft. He watched it for just a few minutes and then they got in the craft and took off. Meanwhile, he had no idea, but people were calling in to the local sheriff's department talking about a UFO in the vicinity. I love this case because the media didn't portray it as him seeing little 6-inch oil can-like creatures. They claimed he had seen beer can aliens. Only in Minnesota would people see beer can aliens. So he goes rushing right down to the sheriff's department. When he got back in his car, it started up, it started working properly. So he rushes down to the sheriff's department. No idea that they're already fielding calls. 2 officers come back with him to the spot. Of course, the UFO is gone, but there in the middle of the road is a weird oil-like substance. One of the officers wrote that it was the weirdest thing he had ever encountered in his entire law enforcement career. And it must have been really weird because they didn't take a photo of it. They didn't take a sample of it. They simply just said, this is the weirdest thing ever. Let's leave it here and go about our day, which they did. Not long after, the road was repaved. Some that I spoke with thought that it was a cover-up for the government's UFO sighting. Others believed the road was simply in bad condition and had to be replaced. 1984, UFOs struck Minnesota again. A truck-driving couple were leaving Colorado, heading to Madison, Wisconsin. While they were leaving, they were plagued by mysterious bright lights that would follow them. No matter how fast they went, the lights kept up with them. When they slowed down, the lights stayed with them. Eventually, by the time they hit Minnesota, these lights had transformed into small prehistoric bird-looking creatures that were now attacking the rig. When they left Colorado, they had a freshly painted rig But when they pulled into this truck stop in Sauk Center, the rig was completely pockmarked, as though someone was throwing rocks against the paint, or perhaps prehistoric bird-like creatures were attacking it. They immediately drove in, pulled into the restaurant, ran inside screaming about aliens attacking them. Of course, this got the attention of the diners inside. They ran outside along with the local sheriff's deputy and a newspaper reporter. I spoke with the newspaper reporter who told me that they claimed the aliens were now in the trees hovering by the restaurant. And when I asked her if she saw anything in the trees, she told me she could see dark objects moving in the trees, but she didn't want to go in because she had young children at home at the time and she wasn't going to take any chances. I talked with the officer years after he retired. He told me he believed the truckers but thought they were on drugs. In other words, he believed that they believed their story, but he thought the story was not credible at all. But the truck drivers were so afraid, they refused to drive any farther. The trucking company had to send for another replacement driver. Instead, the couple left the travel stop, went to the nearby hotel and booked a room. There in the hotel, they also believed that the aliens were attacking them inside the room. The good news is the hotel's still there. It is now America's best value inn. You can spend the night there and see if any aliens attack you while you're at your rest. But as I'm running low on time for this program, here is what I hope you take from today's program. If you turn on your television or read your newspaper or listen to NPR, or God forbid you consult the internet, you'll probably say something similar to this. The world has gone crazy. Can you believe how crazy the world is? And I agree with you. The world is absolutely crazy. But hopefully this program illustrates that the world was crazy 100 years ago as well. It will probably be crazy 100 years from now when they look back at us and wonder what the heck we were doing with our stories. So that's what I hope you take away from the program, this bizarre history of Minnesota. But I really hope your adventure doesn't end here today after this program. Go to my website, grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of Minnesota. And when you do, I think you'll discover that you live in one heck of a weird state. What I mean by that is on your adventure, you'll meet some weird people, you'll see some odd things, and along the way you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is usually yourself. So with that, I again want to thank the library for having me here for this program. I can't think of another time in our history where the library was as important as it is to the community today. With all that's going on in politics, medicine, society, libraries are the fabric that holds our community together. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like this program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a lot of work into getting me to do this program today, and they should be applauded, and thank you all for coming.